What started as a simple traffic violation quickly turned into a legal showdown that shook an entire town. When Samuel Grayson walked into Judge Gerald Whitaker's courtroom, he expected nothing more than an unfair fine. Instead, he exposed a system built on corruption, discrimination, and greed. But taking down a man who had ruled his courtroom like a king for years? That wasn't going to be easy. As the trial unfolded, hidden truths came to light, alliances shattered, and the walls began closing in on the judge. But Whitaker wasn't the only one with secrets. His power stretched far beyond the courthouse, and Samuel was about to discover just how deep the corruption ran. How do you bring down a man who thinks he's untouchable? And what happens when the law is turned against those who abuse it? This is a story of justice, power, and the moment when everything changed. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you love gripping stories filled with twists, suspense, and justice served cold, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The town's courthouse was a relic of the past, its wooden panels darkened with age, its high ceiling making voices echo ominously. Judge Gerald Whitaker sat at the bench, his gavel resting beside him like a scepter of power. His reputation preceded him, a man known for harsh, unrelenting sentences, especially toward people of color. The air was thick with a sense of routine. People came, were fined, and left. No one ever fought back. No one ever won. Then he walked in. A tall, well-dressed black man, his posture confident, his expression calm. He carried himself like a man who knew his rights. The name on the docket, Samuel Grayson. Your Honor, Samuel said smoothly as he stood at the defendant's table. I've been accused of running a red light, but there's an issue with that charge. The traffic signal at Main and Oak is malfunctioning. Judge Whitaker barely glanced up. Enough. You're guilty. He grabbed the gavel. The fine is, Your Honor, if I may. Whitaker's eyes snapped up, filled with irritation. You may not. This is my courtroom, and I don't tolerate disruptions. The gavel slammed down. The judge fined Samuel immediately, without hearing his defense. The courtroom murmured. Even the clerks exchanged glances. It was fast, too fast. Samuel didn't react with anger, only a measured breath. I respectfully asked the court to consider that the light was faulty, another word, and you'll be fined for contempt. Judge Whitaker smirked and added another fine for disturbing court proceedings. The room went silent. People had seen this before. They knew how this played out. But Samuel simply adjusted his tie, his eyes steady. I see, he said. Then I'll be filing an appeal. Whitaker's smirk faded. This was unusual. No one appealed. They paid the fine and left. The judge's fingers tightened around his gavel. Appeal denied. Samuel tilted his head. That's not how the law works, Your Honor. The air in the room changed. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, his ego bruised. In a flash of frustration, Whitaker ordered the bailiffs to remove Samuel from the courtroom. The officers hesitated. This wasn't normal, but a look from Whitaker, and they moved forward. That's when Samuel reached into his jacket. Instead of resisting, he pulled out a golden badge. A murmur spread through the room like wildfire. My name is Samuel Grayson, he said, holding the badge up for all to see. I'm a federal investigator with the Department of Justice. The entire courtroom went still. Judge Whitaker's face drained of color. Samuel let the silence settle before continuing. And Your Honor, I am here investigating you. The gavel slipped from Whitaker's grasp. It hit the desk with a dull thud. No one moved. No one breathed. For the first time in years, the most powerful man in the room wasn't the judge. And that was just the beginning. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The bailiffs stood frozen, their hands halfway to their belts, unsure whether to proceed or step back. Judge Whitaker's usually confident demeanor wavered, his jaw clenched tight. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. Samuel Grayson remained still, holding up his badge, his gaze locked onto the judge. A whisper rippled through the audience. A federal investigator? Investigating the judge? The words bounced off the courtroom walls, growing louder. This wasn't just another day in Whitaker's court. Finally, Whitaker found his voice, though it was weaker than before. "This is an outrageous stunt," he snapped. "This is my courtroom, and you will respect it." Samuel lowered his badge, but didn't move from his position. His voice remained calm. "Your courtroom still belongs to the law, Your Honor." Whitaker's knuckles turned white as he gripped the bench. "I don't care who you are. You were fined for disrupting court proceedings. If you refuse to comply, I have every right to hold you in contempt." Samuel reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I wasn't disrupting anything," he said, placing the file on the defendant's table. "But I do have some disruptions to address specifically regarding your rulings." The judge's eyes darted to the folder. He didn't move. Samuel flipped it open. "Over the last 5 years, there's been a disproportionate number of heavy fines and extended sentences given to minority defendants in your courtroom. The data is clear." He slid a document across the table. "Would you like to explain why, in identical traffic violations, white defendants received verbal warnings while black defendants received maximum penalties?" Whitaker's lips pressed together. "This is nonsense," he spat. Samuel remained unfazed. "I'd call it a pattern." A rustle of papers sounded from the jury box. One of the clerks, a young woman with glasses, hesitated before standing. Her voice was shaky. I've seen this too." All eyes snapped to her. The judge turned to the clerk, his expression darkening. "Sit down. That's an order." She swallowed, but didn't move. "Your Honor, I've been working in this courthouse for years. I've processed the case files. Mr. Grayson is right. There's a pattern." The murmurs in the audience grew louder. The other court clerks exchanged nervous glances. The truth, long buried, was now clawing its way to the surface. Samuel nodded at the clerk in appreciation before turning back to Whitaker. "This investigation isn't new," he continued. "For months, we've been looking into allegations of judicial misconduct. The missing case files, the unusually high fines, the dismissed appeals." Whitaker's nostrils flared. "You have no proof." Samuel lifted another sheet of paper. "Actually, we do." He walked toward the bailiff and handed it over. The officer hesitated, glancing between Samuel and the judge before reading the document. His face paled. "It's a formal notice," Samuel explained. "The Department of Justice has opened an official case against you." The courtroom exploded into murmurs, gasps, and hushed conversations. Whitaker slammed his fist on the bench. "This is a witch hunt." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Funny. I thought this was a courtroom." Laughter nervous, shock broke out from the audience. Even some of the jurors smirked. But beneath the amusement, tension was rising. Whitaker was losing control. His gaze darted to the bailiffs, then to the courtroom exits. His mind raced. He needed to regain power fast. "I will not stand for this humiliation," he hissed. Samuel took a step closer. His voice, though quiet, sliced through the chaos. "You're not standing for anything, Your Honor. You're falling." The judge's chest rose and fell rapidly. His world, his empire, was cracking beneath him. And Samuel Grayson was just getting started. Judge Gerald Whitaker had ruled over this courtroom for more than a decade, his word treated as law. But now, for the first time, he was losing control. His fingers drummed against the bench as he scanned the courtroom. The bailiffs were hesitant, the clerks whispering amongst themselves. Even the audience, who had always watched his rulings in fearful silence, now looked at him differently. Doubt, suspicion, recognition. Samuel Grayson remained composed, standing with the confidence of a man who had already won the battle. He tapped the file in front of him. "Your Honor, would you like to continue this hearing, or should we discuss the falsified citations?" Whitaker's pulse pounded in his ears. "You're lying," he snapped, though the words fell hollow. Samuel didn't even blink. He simply turned another page. "This report," he said, holding it up, "details multiple instances where the traffic light at Main and Oak was manually altered." A collective murmur spread through the room. Whitaker stiffened. That traffic light. The one Samuel had supposedly run. Altered, one of the jury members repeated. What does that mean? Samuel looked around the room, addressing everyone now. It means that the timing of the light was changed to make it nearly impossible to avoid a violation. He paused. A trap. The murmur turned into outright gasps. One of the officers, standing near the door, frowned. Who would do something like that? Samuel slowly turned his gaze back to the judge. The implication hit like a gunshot. A voice suddenly cut through the noise. I've been trying to say this for years. A police officer, Sergeant David Morales, stood up from the back row. His uniform was neatly pressed, but his expression was weighed down by guilt. Whitaker's eyes widened. Morales, sit down. The officer ignored him. That traffic light? We reported malfunctions dozens of times. But every time, the reports disappeared. He turned to Samuel. It makes sense now. Someone was making sure it stayed broken. And now we know why. The tension in the room became unbearable. The clerk, the one who had spoken earlier, stood up again. Her voice was stronger this time. I processed some of those citations, she admitted. And I noticed that the judge dismissed them for certain people. Samuel nodded, encouraging her to continue. I thought it was a mistake at first, but she looked down, ashamed. Every time it was someone white, the case was thrown out. But Black and Latino drivers? They always got the maximum fine. The words landed like a sledgehammer. A woman in the audience suddenly stood up. I knew it, she shouted. I got fined last year for something I didn't do. And when I tried to fight it, he threatened to add another fine. Another voice. Then another. One by one, more people stood. More accusations. More voices rising against the judge. Whitaker's face turned red. This is an attack, he roared, his voice echoing through the room. You're all falling for a federal agent's lies. I have done nothing wrong. Samuel simply folded his arms. Then you won't mind answering a few more questions under oath. The judge's mouth opened, then closed. The walls were closing in. The courtroom, his courtroom, was slipping away from him. And for the first time, he had no power to stop it. Judge Gerald Whitaker gripped the edges of his bench as though it could anchor him in place. But the tide had shifted. His authority, once absolute, was slipping through his fingers. The courtroom was no longer under his control. The people who had once sat in silent submission were now standing one by one accusing him. Samuel Grayson remained where he was, steady and composed. He didn't need to raise his voice. The weight of the truth was speaking for him. Your Honor, he said, placing his hands flat on the defendant's table. If you truly believe you've done nothing wrong, then I invite you to explain why so many cases in your courtroom have followed the same disturbing pattern. Whitaker scoffed. This is absurd. I'm not answering to a traffic violator. Samuel gave him a knowing look. I think we've established that I'm more than that. The judge's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, the clerk stepped forward again. There's more, she said, gripping a folder in her hands. Whitaker's gaze snapped to her. I said sit down. But she didn't. Instead, she looked at Samuel. We keep records of every citation, every fine, every adjustment to sentencing. I started looking through them after I noticed the pattern. Samuel gestured for her to continue. Her hands trembled as she opened the folder. Some of the dismissed cases were never properly filed, she explained. It's like they were erased from the system. Samuel's eyes darkened. Are you saying the judge personally removed records? I don't know if it was him directly, but she hesitated, then pulled out a signed order. Samuel took the document, scanned it, and turned it around for the room to see. The judge's signature. Clear. Unmistakable. The room erupted. He's been rigging cases, someone shouted. My cousin lost his job because of one of those fines. A man in the back stood up. This court ruined my life. The tension boiled over. The bailiffs, who had once followed Whitaker's every command, were now frozen, unsure of what to do. And Whitaker, he was trapped. He slammed his fist on the bench. I will not be disrespected in my own courtroom. Samuel let out a slow breath. It's not your courtroom, Your Honor. Whitaker's face turned a deep shade of red. This is a coordinated attack, a conspiracy against me. Samuel tilted his head. If that's true, then perhaps you'd like to explain the offshore accounts. The judge froze. A second folder landed on the table. Samuel flipped it open. Multiple transactions linked to payments suspiciously matching court fines. Money being funneled into private accounts under aliases. He tapped the document. All traced back to you. Whitaker's breath hitched. Samuel glanced at the jury. You were profiting from this, weren't you? The murmurs in the room grew louder. Whitaker's hands shook as he pointed at Samuel. You planted that evidence. Samuel smirked. Of course. I hacked into bank records and fabricated an entire money laundering operation just so I could fight a traffic ticket. A ripple of laughter broke through the tension. Whitaker's mind raced. He needed to escape this, needed to shut this down now. His eyes darted to the nearest bailiff. Arrest him. Whitaker shouted, pointing at Samuel. The bailiff didn't move. Instead, another voice rang out from the doorway. Actually, Your Honor, I think it's time we arrested you. All heads turned. Standing at the entrance of the courtroom was Chief Daniel Harrington, the town's police chief. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The cuffs in his hands? For Judge Whitaker. Judge Gerald Whitaker sat frozen on the bench, his once dominant presence now a mere shadow of itself. His hands clenched the polished wood, his knuckles white as the reality of the moment crashed over him. Chief Daniel Harrington stepped forward, his boots echoing in the silent courtroom. In his hand, the cold steel of a pair of handcuffs reflected the overhead lights. This is a joke, Whitaker hissed. You have no authority to. Chief Harrington pulled out a sealed arrest warrant and unfolded it with precision. Actually, I do. This warrant was signed this morning. He lifted his gaze. By the Attorney General. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, disbelieving stares. Whitaker's lips parted, but no words came out. Samuel Grayson crossed his arms, watching the judge unravel. Harrington stepped closer. Judge Gerald Whitaker, you are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and judicial misconduct. A flicker of pure rage flashed in Whitaker's eyes. You can't do this, he spat. I am the highest legal authority in this court. Harrington's jaw tightened. Not anymore. Whitaker's eyes darted to the bailiffs. Do your jobs and remove these people now. The bailiffs didn't move. One of them, an older officer with silver, at his temples, slowly unclipped his badge and dropped it onto the floor. It clattered against the tiles. I won't protect a corrupt judge, he said. Another bailiff followed suit. Then another. The balance of power had completely shifted. Samuel watched it all unfold, his expression unreadable. Whitaker's breathing grew erratic. He grabbed the edges of his bench, as if the polished wood could somehow save him. His final card. The last shred of influence he had left. With shaking fingers, he reached for his phone. He dialed the number of Senator Albright, the powerful politician he had served for years. The line rang once, twice. Then this number has been disconnected. Whitaker's world shattered. Samuel let out a quiet chuckle. Seems like your friends abandoned you. The judge's hand trembled as he lowered the phone. No more allies. No more power. Only consequences. The weight of it finally crashed down on him. His body sagged into the bench. His kingdom had fallen. Chief Harrington stepped forward. Hands where I can see them. The judge's fingers twitched. His gaze darted to the audience. The same people he had sentenced, fined, ruined. And now they were watching him fall. For the first time in his career, he was the one being judged. A chuckle came from the jury box. A brawny man with a thick mustache grinned. I came here thinking this was just a traffic violation case. He looked around the courtroom. Turns out I got a front row seat to history. Laughter rippled through the room. Even the court clerks, once terrified of Whitaker, smiled. Samuel exhaled, shaking his head in amusement. Fitting, isn't it? The sound of metal clicking cut through the moment. Harrington snapped the cuffs onto Whitaker's wrists. The judge didn't resist, didn't fight, because there was nothing left to fight for. Harrington pulled him to his feet. Whitaker's final act as judge was stepping down from the bench in handcuffs. As he was led toward the exit, a voice called after him, "Hey, Judge." Whitaker turned his head slightly. Samuel smirked. "Don't worry. I hear they have plenty of time to appeal where you're going." The courtroom erupted, and with that, the reign of Gerald Whitaker was over. The wooden doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind Judge Whitaker as Chief Harrington led him away in handcuffs. The echoes of that sound lingered in the air, mixing with the murmurs of disbelief and vindication rippling through the audience. For the first time in years, Whitaker's courtroom belonged to the people again. Samuel Grayson watched as the tension slowly unraveled, the once oppressive atmosphere dissipating. The weight that had suffocated this town was finally lifting. A woman in the front row, her hands clasped together, let out a shaky breath. "It's really over," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might undo everything. Samuel nodded. "It's over." But not completely. There were still pieces left to clean up. As Samuel turned back to the judge's bench, he saw one of the clerks hesitating, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. Her nameplate read, Lisa Turner. She had been the first to speak against Whitaker. Now, she stepped forward cautiously, her expression torn between duty and relief. "There's something else," she said, voice barely above a whisper. The room quieted. Samuel motioned for her to continue. She swallowed hard, then placed the folder onto the bench where Whitaker had sat. "Just moments ago. These are the files he tried to destroy." Gasps filled the room. Samuel's fingers brushed against the manila cover before flipping it open. The documents inside were stamped with court seals, but many were missing official signatures. Others had entire sections blacked out, attempts to erase evidence of wrongful convictions. His jaw clenched. "This isn't just corruption," he murmured. "This is systematic abuse." Lisa nodded, her eyes shining with frustration. He didn't just find people unfairly. He pushed for extended sentences, seized property. He made sure certain cases never saw an appeal. Samuel exhaled slowly. "How many cases?" Lisa hesitated. "Hundreds." The weight of that number settled over the room. People shifted uncomfortably, as if the walls themselves were whispering the truth back at them. A man in the back spoke up, voice hoarse. "So what happens now?" Samuel looked up, scanning the faces in the room. "We fix it." But it wouldn't be easy, because justice wasn't just about removing corruption, it was about repairing what had been broken. At that moment, the doors creaked open again. Another man stepped inside, older, dignified, with sharp eyes that scanned the room with quiet authority. Lisa's breath hitched. "That's Judge William Carter." The murmurs began again, this time with a different energy. Judge Carter was a retired federal judge, one of the few who had fought against the corruption in the legal system. He cleared his throat, silencing the room. "I was requested by the Attorney General to oversee the transition," he announced. "Until a new judge is officially appointed, I will be reviewing every single case Judge Whitaker ever ruled on." Samuel exchanged a glance with Lisa. This wasn't just justice. This was restoration. The people who had suffered under Whitaker's rule would have their voices heard again. The system that had failed them would be forced to make it right. And the first case Judge Carter reviewed? Samuel Grayson's own ticket. He tapped the document against his palm, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Mr. Grayson, I believe you had a case to appeal?" The room erupted in laughter and applause. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "I think we both know I never actually ran that light." Judge Carter nodded. "Then let's make it official." He picked up the gavel, the very same gavel that Whitaker had wielded as a weapon, and, with one decisive motion, he slammed it down. Case dismissed. The final judgment had been made. Justice had won. The gavel's final crack echoed through the courtroom, sealing the fate of Samuel Grayson's case, and symbolizing something far greater, the end of an era of corruption. Judge Carter set the gavel down, exhaling deeply. The room was still buzzing, the townspeople struggling to process what had just happened. Some whispered in disbelief, Others nodded in quiet vindication. Samuel, however, remained standing, his gaze drifting toward the pile of unresolved cases that Lisa Turner had unearthed. The battle against Whitaker had been won, but justice was not yet complete. "Mr. Grayson," Carter said, his voice drawing Samuel's attention, "you may no longer be a defendant, but I have a feeling you're not leaving this courtroom just yet." Samuel smirked. "I think you're right about that, Your Honor." He turned to Lisa. "Those cases, how long would it take to sort through all of them?" Lisa adjusted her glasses, already flipping through the files. "Months, maybe years, depending on how deep the corruption runs." Samuel nodded. "Then let's start now." Before Lisa could respond, the doors swung open again. A group of lawyers in sharp suits strode into the courtroom, led by a woman with sharp features and an air of authority. "Apologies for the late entrance," she announced. "We came as soon as we heard the news." Lisa's eyes widened. "Who are you?" The woman smiled. "I'm Amanda Reeves, legal counsel with the Civil Rights Division. And this," she gestured to the team behind her, "is your new task force." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Judge Carter leaned back, impressed. "I assume the Attorney General sent you?" Amanda nodded. "We're here to review every wrongful conviction, overturned case, and fraudulent fine that Judge Whitaker issued. If anyone was unfairly sentenced under his rulings, we're getting them out." The room erupted. People cheered. Some clapped. Others wept in relief. For many, justice wasn't just about taking Whitaker down. It was about restoring what had been stolen years, money, livelihoods. Lisa turned to Samuel, her voice trembling. "Did you know about this?" Samuel chuckled. "Let's just say I made a few calls." He had spent months investigating Whitaker's corruption, but he hadn't just come to expose the truth. He had come to fix it. And now, for the first time, the system was fighting for the right side. A familiar voice suddenly cut through the noise. "Mr. Grayson?" Samuel turned and found himself face to face with a man in an orange jumpsuit. The room fell silent again. The man, Marcus Holloway, was a former local business owner who had been sentenced under Whitaker's court. He had spent 5 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Tears welled in his eyes as he shook Samuel's hand. "I don't know how to thank you," Marcus choked out. I thought I'd never see justice." Samuel tightened his grip. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "But we're not done yet." Judge Carter cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway, your case is one of the first we're reviewing. And from what I see," he held up the file, "this conviction never should have happened." The gavel slammed down once more. "Your case is overturned. You're a free man." Marcus staggered backward, covering his face as the crowd exploded in applause. One by one, more names would be cleared. More lives would be restored. And for the first time in a long time, this courthouse was serving the law, not twisting it. Samuel turned to Lisa, his smirk returning. "Still think it'll take years?" Lisa grinned. "Not if we do this right." And with that, the real work began. The sun had long since set outside the courthouse, but inside, the work was only beginning. Stacks of wrongful convictions, excessive fines, and dismissed appeals covered every available surface. What had once been Judge Whitaker's domain of unchecked power was now the center of a legal reckoning. Samuel Grayson stood at the heart of it, sleeves rolled up, scanning file after file. The air buzzed with quiet determination as attorneys, clerks, and even local volunteers worked through the mountain of injustice left in Whitaker's wake. Despite the momentum, Samuel knew this was just the beginning, because for every case they overturned, another name surfaced, another life destroyed by the judge's greed. Lisa Turner dropped a thick folder onto the desk beside him, sighing. "This one's bad." Samuel glanced at the name on the top. Marlon Hayes. "What happened?" he asked. Lisa rubbed her temples. "He was arrested 3 years ago for resisting arrest, but there was no actual crime. No charges before that. Just an officer claiming he didn't comply during a traffic stop." Samuel's jaw tightened. It was a familiar story. Too familiar. Amanda Reeves, the head civil rights attorney, leaned over. "He's still serving time?" Lisa nodded grimly. For years left. Amanda exhaled. Then we get him out. Before anyone could move, the front doors burst open. Two men in prison uniforms stepped inside, flanked by officers. Gasps rippled through the room. Samuel recognized one of them immediately. Marlon Hayes. Lisa's eyes widened. How did one of the officers, Sergeant Morales, the same man who had spoken out in court, step forward? We heard what was happening, he said. The governor ordered immediate reviews of nonviolent cases linked to Whitaker. Samuel's eyebrows rose. And Morales smirked. Marlon Hayes is a free man. A stunned silence fell over the room. Then cheering. People clapped. Some wept. A woman, Marlon's sister, rushed forward and hugged him so tightly it looked like she'd never let go. Samuel stepped forward, offering his hand. Welcome back. Marlon shook it, his grip strong. Took y'all long enough, he said with a smirk, though his eyes were glassy with emotion. Lisa wiped at her eyes. I can't believe it's happening this fast. Amanda grinned. Justice doesn't wait. Samuel nodded, but said nothing. His mind was already moving to the next step. Because while people like Marlon were finally getting their freedom, there was still unfinished business. And it started with who had helped Whitaker stay in power. Samuel turned to Amanda. We need to talk. She caught the seriousness in his tone and motioned for him to follow. They stepped into a quieter room, where Samuel laid out another confidential file. This case isn't just about Whitaker, he said. It's about the people who enabled him. Amanda's brow furrowed as she scanned the document. Her eyes widened. This, she whispered, this is bigger than just a corrupt judge. Samuel nodded. It always was. Because Judge Whitaker wasn't the only one pulling the strings. And before this was over, they were going after all of them. Samuel Grayson watched as Amanda Reeves flipped through the confidential file, her expression darkening with every page. The evidence was undeniable. Judge Whitaker had been a powerful force in the courtroom, but he hadn't operated alone. He had protection. He had enablers. And now it was time to bring them down. Amanda exhaled sharply, closing the folder. This isn't just judicial corruption, she said. It's a network. Samuel nodded. The question is, how deep does it go? Lisa Turner and Sergeant Morales stepped into the room, sensing the shift in urgency. What's going on? Morales asked. Samuel tapped the file. Whitaker wasn't just handing out unfair sentences, he was funneling money from those fines into private accounts. But he wasn't the only one profiting. Amanda slid a bank statement across the table. Lisa's eyes widened. Wait, this isn't Whitaker's account. No, Amanda confirmed. It belongs to Senator Albright. The room fell into stunned silence. Senator Richard Albright was one of the most powerful politicians in the state. He had built his career on a platform of law and order, pushing for harsher sentencing laws and increased police funding. Now, the truth was out. Whitaker had been feeding him money funneling, illegally obtained fines into the senator's campaign fund. Samuel ran a hand over his face. This is bigger than I thought. Amanda nodded. We take down Albright, and we expose everyone involved. But Morales crossed his arms. A sitting senator? That's not going to be easy. Samuel smirked. Neither was taking down a judge in his own courtroom. Morales chuckled, but his expression was serious. So what's the plan? Samuel leaned forward. We hit them where it hurts. The next morning, Samuel walked into the courthouse not as a defendant, but as a man on a mission. Reporters were already outside, covering the aftermath of Whitaker's arrest. The public wanted answers, and they were about to get them. That afternoon, Judge Carter held a special hearing this time, with Samuel as a key witness. As he took the stand, the room packed with onlookers, victims of Whitaker, lawyers seeking justice, government officials watching carefully, and at the center of it all, Senator Richard Albright. He sat near the back, composed, his face unreadable. But Samuel knew better. He could see the tension in Albright's shoulders, the slight twitch in his fingers. He knew the senator had tried to distance himself from Whitaker the moment the judge had been arrested. But today, that wasn't going to work. Samuel cleared his throat. I was accused of running a red light, he began. I walked into this courtroom expecting a fine. What I found instead was a corrupt system designed to exploit the people it was supposed to protect. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Samuel continued, his voice strong. Judge Whitaker was at the top of that system. But corruption like this doesn't survive without powerful friends. He turned his gaze directly to Albright. The senator stiffened. Amanda Reeves stood from the prosecution's table, holding up bank records. These financial statements show direct transfers between Judge Whitaker's accounts and campaign funds linked to Senator Albright. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Albright shot to his feet. This is outrageous. Samuel raised an eyebrow. So was locking people away for profit. The cameras flashed. The reporters scrambled to write every word. Albright's face turned red. I have nothing to do with this, Amanda smirked. Then you won't mind answering a few questions under oath. At that moment, FBI agents entered the courtroom. A hush fell over the room. Samuel folded his arms. Or maybe you'd prefer to discuss it at federal headquarters. Albright froze. The net had closed. And just like Whitaker before him, he had nowhere left to run. The tension in the courtroom was electric. Senator Richard Albright stood rigid, his eyes darting between the FBI agents near the entrance and the flashing cameras from the press gallery. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't in control. Samuel Grayson remained seated on the witness stand, his expression unreadable. He had spent months uncovering the corruption that had poisoned this courthouse. Judge Whitaker had been the first to fall, but Albright was the real prize. And now it was happening in front of the entire country. Judge Carter tapped his gavel twice, bringing order to the murmuring crowd. His sharp eyes settled on Albright. Senator, the evidence presented today raises serious concerns. Are you willing to answer these allegations under oath? Albright scoffed, straightening his expensive suit. This is a political hit job. I will not be subjected to a sham hearing orchestrated by a disgraced investigator. Samuel smirked. Funny. I'm not the one under federal investigation. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Albright's jaw tightened. One of the FBI agents, a stern woman in a dark suit, stepped forward. Senator Albright, you are under federal scrutiny for corruption, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. We strongly suggest you comply. Samuel leaned back in his chair. This was checkmate. Albright's fists clenched. He wasn't used to being cornered. His whole career, he had operated above the law, manipulating the system to serve his ambitions. But today, the system was fighting back. The silence stretched. Every camera in the room was trained on Albright. He exhaled sharply. Fine, he muttered, his voice tight with resentment. I'll cooperate. Samuel exchanged a glance with Amanda Reeves. They had him. Over the next several weeks, the full extent of the corruption unraveled. Judge Whitaker was formally indicted on multiple charges, including bribery and abuse of power. Albright's campaign finances were exposed, revealing illegal contributions tied to fraudulent court fines. Dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals were released, their names cleared. And for the first time in years, the courthouse wasn't a symbol of oppression, it was a place of justice. Samuel Grayson had come to town as a defendant. Now he was leaving as the man who had restored the law. The courthouse felt different, lighter. The weight of corruption had lifted, replaced by something new hope. Lisa Turner and Sergeant Morales stood by the steps as Samuel approached, his work finally done. Heading back to D.C.? Lisa asked, offering a small smile. Samuel nodded. I have other cases waiting. Morales smirked. You sure you don't want to stick around? We could use someone like you. Samuel chuckled. Tempting, but I think you guys have it under control now. Amanda Reeves approached, extending a hand. You pulled off something incredible here, Grayson. Samuel shook it. So did you. She nodded. We'll keep the investigation going. There's still work to do. Samuel glanced back at the courthouse one last time. It no longer felt like enemy territory. It felt like victory. Just as he turned to leave, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Grayson." He turned Judge Carter. The older man gave him a knowing smile. "You should know. You're officially the first person to ever get a case dismissed in Whitaker's courtroom." Samuel smirked. "I'll take that as a win." Carter chuckled. "Safe travels, son. And thank you." Samuel tipped his head. "Just doing my job." Then, with a final glance at the courthouse, he walked away. His case was closed. But justice? Justice would keep going. And that's how justice was served. What started as a simple traffic case exposed a system of corruption, took down a power-hungry judge, and even led to the fall of a powerful senator. But here's the real question: how many more cases like this exist in the world? How many people have been unfairly punished, simply because those in power thought they could get away with it? Justice isn't just about winning one case, it's about holding the powerful accountable, no matter who they are. So now, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. And if you love stories packed with justice, suspense, and unexpected twists, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button, turn on notifications, and get ready for more mind-blowing stories coming your way. Justice never stops, and neither do we.